Hi everyone. First of all, I want to thank SSI for having us. I know this is not an easy topic to discuss. There are a lot of people out there who are telling us that we can't be LGBTQ and we can't be Jews and Zionists or Israelis at the same time. And this event is evidence to that we can be. And we will not yield to that. So thank you guys for giving us this platform. As Dalia said, last year I started my Master's of Law Studies here at Columbia. And when I became active in the pro-Israel and SSI, people started calling me a Zionist. And the first couple of weeks I was like, thank you. You guys are so nice. In Israel, we've been told that the BDS guys are very bad and anti-Semitic, but thank you. And it took me a while to understand that they are actually trying to swear me, like they're trying to talk it in a derogative way. They're calling me a Nazi, a fascist, a racist, whatever worst thing that you can imagine. And so I thought to myself, I asked them, do you guys even know what Zionism means? And of course they didn't reply because they boycotting us Israelis, so they're not talking to us. So I went online and I Googled it and I went on their website and I read what's their definition of Zionism, and I want to quote for you. It's Zionism is a movement that seeks to establish a distinct new society, take over control of land and resources, and forcibly removes Palestinians, all while engaging in ethnic cleansing. And I looked at it and my first reaction was, what? That's not Zionism. Zionism is a movement that supports the liberation of the Jewish people in their home, in their historical land, Israel. It's supporting the right of the Jewish people in the self-determination among the nation states. Not a word about take control over land and resources, not a word about forcibly remove Palestinians, and especially not a word about ethnic cleansing. Not a word about that. Now, I take pride in being an Israeli, and I take pride in being a Zionist, and I take pride in being a gay man. I want to share with you a little bit of my background. My grandparents from my father's side are Holocaust survivors. They came to Israel after they fled from the horrors of the Holocaust in Europe. Most of their families were murdered by the Nazis. My father grew up almost without having any grandparents or grandparents at all. Me and my brother, we grew up hearing about the horrors of the Holocaust, about my grandparents' life in the ghetto, in the death camps. My grandparents from my mother's side came from Libya. They had to flee Tripoli after my great-grandfather was murdered by Muslims in Muslim riots. And they came to Israel. And they didn't give up after the hours that they had to go through. They didn't give up after everything they've been through. They went to Israel and they established a country. They established their own state. Now, I also grew up in Israel as a gay man. And growing up throughout my life, I always felt like I was a minority within my society. The LGBTQ community in Israel is a discriminated community. While we enjoy many rights in comparison to a lot of different countries, we still have our inequality and discrimination in our society. And as a gay man, I identify with LGBTQ suffering across the world. I feel connected to LGBTQ people across the world. And I remember when we all heard a couple of months ago about the terrible executions that's been done in Chechnya for gay men. And I remember while the LGBTQ Israeli community protested against the Russian embassy in Tel Aviv, I thought to myself, what would have happened if there was an LGBTQ country, like the Jews have? The Jews were prosecuted and discriminated across the world, but they took responsibility on their own fate, and they created something. They didn't just give up. They went to Israel, and they created their own country to protect themselves. So what would have happened if the LGBTQ community would have had the same thing? Would it change the fate of those gay men in Chechnya? Would they be alive today? And for me, the Zionist story is something that empowers me. It gives me inspiration in my LGBTQ activity. Now, as Dalia said, I studied here last year, and I wanted to see what's the old BDS fuss that everyone are talking about in Israel. So I went on their first event, and I heard that it's okay to do terror against Israelis, because that's what you get after you choke people for 69 years. It was last year. And I was shocked, but nothing actually shocked me more than the second event that I went to regarding the LGBTQ community. Now, when I got the invitation, I looked at it, and to tell you the truth, I was in conflict within myself, because as an Israeli, as a Zionist, as a Jew, I object to everything that the BDS movement stands for and their tactics. But as I said, as a gay man, I identify with LGBTQ suffering, and I feel related to the LGBTQ Palestinian community as well. Like, they're being prosecuted for the same reason that my community is being discriminated. So I went to that event, on the one hand, feeling a little bit torn apart. But what I heard in that event shocked me even more than what I heard in the first event, because they weren't even talking about the LGBTQ community in Palestine, in the Palestinian territories. They weren't talking about them at all. They were talking about, they basically deflected the blame towards Israel. They weren't talking about the criminalization of gay men in the Palestinian territories. They weren't talking about discrimination in gay territories. They weren't talking about persecution. They didn't talk about honor killing of gay men in the Palestinian territories. All they talked about was Israel. Israel is to blame for everything. Israel is to blame for the criminal law in Gaza Strip. Israel is to blame for the persecution of the LGBTQ community in Palestine, in Palestinian territories, from their own government and society. And then you look at it and you understand it's just a tactic. They're just using us. They're just using the LGBTQ community as a tool to attack Israel. They're not talking about the LGBTQ community at all. Now, I don't pretend to speak for the LGBTQ community, the Palestinian community. It's not. I identify with their suffering, but I don't pretend to speak on their behalf. But I will tell you one thing, that I'm a minority who's being discriminated in my community, in my country. I fight. We are activists in our community. We take responsibility on our destiny. We fight, we argue, we win. We promote our human rights. And we fight with our government, with our society, within our government, within our society, to promote our rights. If someone would have used my human rights suffering as a tool, they are my human rights struggle. And this is something that I think that everyone, especially in the LGBT community, we need to oppose to, because our human rights suffering is not a tool. And if you're using that to promote your own agenda, that's something that we need to work against you. Now, that event didn't only influence me in that perspective. When I got here, on my first day of studying, I sat down in a classroom with 250 master's students from across the world, and we were asked to introduce ourselves. And I remember I sat down in my chair, and all I heard was China, Japan, Pakistan, Peru, Argentina, Brazil, Israel, United States, Canada. And I looked at myself across the classroom and I said, wow, this is a huge database for LGBTQ human rights status across the world. Like, we can do something about this. So I started an initiative for international students to share what's going on in their countries about LGBTQ rights. I want to hear about the LGBTQ situation in China. I want to hear about what's going on in Brazil. It interests me. And I approached two presidents from two LGBTQ organizations here, student organization here at Columbia. And we talked about doing something together, like, we can enrich also the American students about what's going on in our countries. And a couple of weeks after that, I received an invitation to the SJP and the JVP event about the LGBTQ community that I told you about. But it wasn't from SJP or from JVP. It was one of the LGBTQ organizations. So I rushed to the president of that organization, and I told him, how can you cooperate with these organizations? Like, they're saying that it's okay it's justified to kill innocent Israelis just because, that's what you get after choking a people for 69 years. And the answer was that they don't interfere with freedom of speech, and that the board has already voted. So they co-sponsored the event. And that put me in a choice. Either I'm going to choose between my Jewish Zionist Israeli identity and not cooperate with them, or am I going with my LGBTQ identity and promoting the agenda that I wanted to promote? I eventually chose not to decide, and I didn't cooperate with them, but we did the event anyway, and it was a big success. And I have to say that the only people who lost from this were the American students of this organization, because they weren't around in the room to hear what we shared. So I kind of created my own space. But I want to tell you something. I know that I don't look like it, but I'm old. I know it's a shock. And I came to this campus after being an officer in the IDF, after being a senior advisor to a minister in Israel, after being an openly gay man for 12 years. I feel confident and I'm strong. But I'm thinking about what's going on with students who are younger than me, who needs the support of this LGBTQ organization, who need those safe spaces. They need to make a choice. Either you go and you work with an organization that co-sponsored events like that, or you don't have your own safe space. Now that's an impossible choice. But I want to use this example to put a mirror in front of ourselves as well, because we're talking about the anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic organizations. But LGBTQ people are not being accepted also in Jewish circles. There are a lot of Jewish circles where we're not accepting LGBTQ people. And we need to take example of what's going on in the other side. And we need to understand that if we want to be a people, we need to include everyone. We need to allow safe spaces to everyone. When they come to attack us, they attack us all. They don't differentiate between LGBTQ and non-LGBTQ. They don't do that. So if there's one thing that I would urge all of you to take from this event, is to go and be active in your Jewish community, to make them more accepted of Jewish, Zionist, Israelis, LGBTQ people, and to allow them those safe spaces within ours. That will make us stronger, and then that's what brings us to our win. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Hannah Simpson. As I mentioned before, my pronouns are she in English and he in Hebrew, which is actually a false cognate that means she. So Dahlia here is going to remind me if I go over 45 minutes. And I have my notes on my phone here, so if I'm staring at it, just acknowledge that. So I want to begin with a quote, and this was actually from an Austrian man, so I'm going to read it in German, and I think that's kind of important, then I'll read it in English. In Salzburg brachte ich eine der glücklichsten Stunden meines Lebens zu. Ich war auch gerne in der schönen Stadt geblieben, aber als Jude war ich nie zur Stellung eines Richters befördert worden. And so this, in English, says, I experienced some of the happiest hours of my life in Salzburg. And this was actually put on a quote, on a billboard, on a board in a city in Salzburg, Germany, and attributed to Theodor Herzl. And what the Austrians left off of that quote was the last part of what I wrote, which said, I would have been happy to stay in this city, but as a Jew, I never would have been promoted to a judge. So I'm beginning with this, and this was Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern Zionism, and I'm going to get back to that in a second, but just to let that sit for a second. And it's important that I've said that it was in German, and this was actually from the summer of 1885, so this was well before the Holocaust. So a little bit about me. I am a transgender woman who spends a lot of time working with other trans youth, speaking about how they come out, helping them through that, helping with their families, all kinds of other work in that sphere, and advocating on a local and national level, again, to improve just understanding of what it means to be diverse in your identity and orientation. And so I like to bring a lot of jokes into that and a lot of my Judaism into that. You know, I tell people that I used to be a conservative Jew, now I'm a Reformed Jew. I had a sect change. People mishear me all the time. They said, you had a sex change? I say that too, separate story. But seriously, the point that I'm trying to go on from this is that I do believe genuinely that there is a place in religion, whatever one yours happens to be, for any queer person who seeks it. It just might not be the sect you were assigned at birth. So I attended Boston University, and then I actually was a medical student here in New York City, not too far from here, in Harlem. And I actually was driven out, unfortunately, when I transitioned. But before then, I had a really interesting experience of working in anatomy class and getting to dissect a human cadaver and poke around, really trying to see where the soul fits. And realizing that there was this bit more of the body that was making it animate, vivacious, alive, that this cadaver in front of me lacked, that I had. And I don't know where that soul fit exactly. I'm still looking, but it allowed me to see just a little bit more of the world, which helps me see, I think, a little bit more of where religion comes into play, where you have to see a larger picture, where you can't look for the simple explanation in anything. And that is kind of some of my Jewish background and a bit of my transgender background, which I'm going to bring into my Zionism now. So I have done 10 trips now to Israel. 3 of them were leading young adult birthright Israel trips. It's a trip for Jewish young adults, usually 18 to 26, we're a little bit older now, where I bring people, I've brought over 100 of them to Israel for the first time, and they were all LGBT buses, so for people self-identifying in that community. And it was a tremendous experience, and I want to start with a story from that, just to give you an idea of how I define Zionism. So we were on the plane, actually, and one of my participants, I was going up and down the aisles. This was a 777, you know, big wide-body jet, trying to make sure that I memorized everybody's name by the time we landed. And one of my participants said, hey, you know, I just saw all the Orthodox Jews go back into the back of the galley of the airplane to pray, and I don't feel comfortable in that space because I'm not an Orthodox Jewish man. And the person sitting next to him was also on my bus, and she said, you know, I'm a woman. I don't feel comfortable there either. I should clarify, they actually came out as non-binary, but at this time they were identifying as female since then. But I said, you know, well, why don't we make our own queer minyan egalitarian in the back of this 777, and they thought about it and said, yes, we're going to lead that, and we're going to have this minyan, this prayer group, a quorum of 10 people of any gender or identity and orientation in the galley after breakfast. So I'm advertising it up and down the plane to the rest of my participants, as well as another birthright bus on the plane, and just whoever else happens to hear it. And I go back and I start counting people, and I hit 11. And the 11th person I don't recognize, and he says, hi there, I'm so-and-so, and I'm a trans man. And I just happened to be on this flight, and I heard what you were doing, and this is the first time I've ever been able to pray on an airplane pointing at Israel. And so as we landed, I explained what had happened to my group, and I said, you know, I'm sort of disappointed on my first birthright bus that you got the point of this trip before we even landed, that two things happened. Number one, both an Orthodox group and us shared the galley of a 777. We used it in tandem and let the crew do its work as well. So we were able to have these spaces simultaneously and exist together. And second of all, that you created a space for this particular individual that could never have existed prior without you being here. When I tell you that I want you to see Israel as a home, it doesn't mean it's the one you live in all the time, but maybe it's like your parents' house, the one you go back to do laundry in. It's the one you have a stake in. It's the one you're going to have to clean out one day when everyone tries to change around you and you want things to stay the same. So it was really important to me to show the way my transgender identity and my Zionist identity actually enhance one another. And the way I see that happening today is to say that I, at least until recently, don't think that I felt anti-Semitism per se here in New York City as a young Jewish person, male or female, the way perhaps my grandparents or great-grandparents did when they were coming to this country in the first place. And you see the remnants of that in some of the facilities that we created throughout even this city and around the country. We created universities when they wouldn't take Jewish students. We created hospitals when they wouldn't treat Jewish patients. We created teachers' colleges and seminaries for ourselves when we didn't have those opportunities elsewhere. And that's really inspiring to myself being a queer person today, where I say, okay, all of the macro and micro aggression that I bet my predecessors felt is probably what I'm feeling today as a trans person. Going back to Theodor Herzl's quote, he was living in Salzburg saying, I spent my happiest days here. I liked being an Austrian as a Jew, but I saw this glass ceiling. I saw what I could be as a Jew or as a trans person, and there was a limit. And maybe we see now that that limit is being tremendously challenged more and more by people running for office, by people kicking ass in their careers, by people getting educations that they once thought they could never even apply to as a queer person, going to medical school. I didn't mention that I was queer on my application. It's kind of funny, actually, after I transitioned and before they drove me out, I suggested that they nominate me for a minority scholarship. And I looked at the rules, and it said, they can define minority as they, see fit. And I thought gender and sexual minorities should definitely be considered. And I said, tongue-in-cheekly, there's only one way that a white Jewish girl from Jersey brings diversity to medicine. And they actually did nominate me as a transgender student. And now there's lots of transgender medical students. I'm unfortunately not one of them anymore. But it's amazing to see what is happening and that ceiling being shattered, but that is through tremendously hard work that our ancestors as Jews achieved. And furthermore, what they thought they needed, the culmination of not decades but centuries of persecution, was not to say, okay, we are going to war with the world, but we are going to create a safe space. And that to me resonates so much. I tell people, queers build 501c3s and Jews build 501c countries. And a few NGOs in them too, though they're not called 501c3s based on our tax code. And it's amazing, this level of magnitude. I call it the largest Jewish nonprofit that ever existed because it's large, it's Jewish, and it's not making a profit. But we built an entire country with all of those things in it, and then layering on top of that all of the work we're doing to advance humanity, technology, the arts, sciences through it. That's something to be proud of. Now, as Assaf mentioned, you know, what if there was an LGBTQ country? I'm not saying we need a Transistan or a Transylvania. There's already that. Sorry, it's taken. But I'm saying it's tremendously important to recognize how you get to the point that you're at. That the Jews, that the Israelis who created this country, that the stake we have and why we are tied to this place is because of the hard work that was done, the tears, the sweat, and sometimes the blood of those who came before us. And I see that in the queer movement, and I can name the activists here in America who've given me the freedom to even explore who I am, let alone be that person every single day. And there's still a long way to go, but it's about that recognition of the process of the journey. So to me, Zionism and trans identities enhance one another because I take nothing for granted. Now again, I am a Jew and I do not believe that Zionism is exclusive to Jews, but I am going to bring in a little bit of religion here. We're coming up on Passover, the holiday that we are going to be celebrating starting this Friday night. And it tells the story of the Exodus from Egypt, and the first line, or one of the first lines in the book we read from, and this is the one that gets glossed over all the time, it says, and a new leader came to power, a new Pharaoh came to power that did not know Joseph, the viceroy of the previous Pharaoh, the Jew, and all he had done for the country. A new leader came to power who did not know Joseph. And I think it's emblematic of the times that we're living in when we've seen a new leader who came to power who did not know of all the things perhaps the queer community, or perhaps even the Jewish community, has done for this country we're living in right now. And you know, I don't know, maybe it's worth looking back at that time in Egypt and, you know, did the Israelites become complacent in their leadership that came to power? Did they not recognize an undercurrent, maybe like we feel like today happened in 2016? I can draw all of these, you know, speculations out in my mind, but what really brings it together is this notion that we have to maintain, and the fight to maintain a right, a country that has been won, that has been declared, is not as glorious as the fight to declare it, to build it in the first place, but the moment we start fighting to maintain things, we start fighting to win them again. As a trans person, I can say that I now have to talk about bathrooms in schools again after President Obama had issued an executive order. That went away. He was about to let trans people serve in the army, and that was starting, and now it's in question again. So I see a lot of parallels between my Zionist identity and my trans identity. Now, what makes it difficult is when I see so many other people who are bringing their queer identities into the space of Israel-Palestine, and it's very easy to latch on to the Palestinian narrative of oppression and not see the bigger picture, and to feel uncomfortable now as a trans person, as a Zionist in those spaces, especially when everything that I'm bringing from my experience is explaining to me why this is tremendously important. And I want to go through a little bit of that right now. So I do have some notes just to make sure that I talk about this in order. And let me know how much time I have left, too, because I want to not be here all night with you lovely people. So the first thing to say is this concept I want to talk about of pinkwashing that gets brought up all of the time. And I want to remind you, it's basically what they say it is the idea that Israel is using its pro-LGBT life, culture, identity, ability to exist as a cover for lots of other things that are happening. And I want to explain why I think it's not a thing, first of all, and remind you it's a meta-argument. And the perniciousness of meta-arguments is that every time you try to argue against it, you're actually doing the very thing that they say is the argument you shouldn't be doing. So I know they're going to call me a pinkwasher, and thank you. That being said, if I talked about Israel in those contexts as a leading citrus exporter, they would call me an orange washer. So the first thing I want to point out is that it erases the real conversations that are being had by people both here and in Israel. Now, remind you that this is not a governmental thing, LGBT rights. We don't just get them from the government when we ask for them. We've been winning them as a people, person by person, coming out to our parents, accepting our children, not casting them off, giving our trans kids a chance to be themselves rather than take their lives. And this is what's happening in Israel as well. So why is the conversation about the government conspiracy when that's erasing the person-to-person narrative? And actually, I was attending a cancel pinkwashing pop-up session at a conference in January, and they had a sheet up on the wall and projecting onto it because they weren't allowed to have an actual presentation at this particular conference of LGBT activism groups. And they were saying, you know, well, we're not trying to erase these individuals without naming a single one, without naming Ofer Erez, the first trans soldier in the IDF to come out and reach the rank of captain, or Sarah Weil, who sits down in the center of Kikar Tzion and just lets people talk and practices radical empathy, and all of these wonderful other names of people I've had a chance to meet personally, because Israel's this, you know, small country where you can go meet people personally, which is really awesome. So, second of all, it's erasing the conversation of the Palestinians and what we need to do and what also they need to do to help themselves. And that's a difficult thing as well for me. And I'll tell you a story. I was sitting in the Jerusalem Open House. It's the LGBT Center for the City of Jerusalem. And I walk inside because I just like to go in there and I buy flags and I buy pins and other kinds of merchandise, but just to see who's around and talk, because it's interesting to come to other LGBT centers around the country or the world and just get to know people. And there were these 4 women with bushy beards and, you know, lots of stubble and very tall, one was wearing a traditional Palestinian dress, one was wearing like, you know, kind of flared jeans and some lipstick, and the other 2 were wearing different kinds of leather outfits and like jackets and then like, you know, jeans and stuff as well. And we walk in and I'm just talking to them and they're like, oh, come eat with us, come eat with us. They just gotten some falafel and pita and they're just shoving food in my face, as is the customary Arab hospitality. Eat this, eat this, eat this. And I'm looking at them and we're translating from Arabic to Hebrew to English, because I don't speak that much Hebrew and they don't speak that much English. And so there's somebody's translating in the middle for us. And so they say this one thing, which I'm going to tell you all a secret, there's no good response to unless you're someone like me. So they said to me, you know, we're trans. And you can't really say, okay, because, like, it doesn't matter what I think about that. And you can't say, I know, because then you're, like, acknowledging that you've clocked them. So I get to say the one thing that's neutral, which is me too. And they're like, really? And immediately the questions come out in every ounce of English they can muster. You know, you have access to hormones. Have you had surgery? All of these questions they want to know. These are these 4 Palestinian women who are just sitting in this room, wearing women's clothing, being themselves in the confines of this basically living room of an office building that's turned into an LGBT center. And we're just talking about their experience. And they said, you know, we've talked to our parents. We're out. They know we want to identify as women, but it's a non-starter in our community. And how do I bring that to a larger audience? How do I tell that story? And it's not a matter of, you know, the conflict, the everything else, the occupation that's going on. It's a matter of how do these people live their lives, and this is their place to be themselves. And I don't know how to help them, but it's erasing that conversation. And the other thing that I've noticed about the pinkwashing argument is the misrepresentation of everything that actually is going on in Israel. So one of the things that they quoted was they said, you know, same-sex marriage is not performed in Israel. And that is actually true. However, what they neglected to mention is that actually You can have a marriage outside of Israel, which is a lot different than leaving the US. You can just fly half an hour to Cyprus, you can go to Europe, you can come to the US, and their marriages are recognized in Israel, as Assaf mentioned. And it's not enough, but when we were having this same conversation in the US as marriage equality was going state by state, and there were civil unions, and there were recognitions of marriages performed in other states under fair faith and credit, etc., about contracts and interstate, and all of this debate, we knew exactly where we were at day by day. So if you're calling yourself a queer organization, why do you need to misrepresent the status of queer people in order to amplify your point? And another point of it they said was that, there's a Religious Freedom Restoration Act kind of things in Israel where you can be denied service based on your religion. And what's really interesting to me is that, yes, there are concerns in Israel about what religious bodies are able to do under personal law, personal affairs law. It's this concept of millets, where different religious bodies sort of govern themselves on personal affairs, so marriage, death, etc., divorce, and there's like the Christian one, the Muslim, and the Jewish. But what's interesting is they don't tell you that that's actually the system the Ottomans put in place. And then it kind of lasted vestigially through the modern state of Israel. So it's interesting that they're complaining about something that was actually an Arab solution to a problem. So I find that really fascinating. And again, like I said, I think is clear, the biggest issue is the double standards that happen. And we talk about LGBT rights here in the US, and you might say if pinkwashing was a thing here, that we'd have no right to have those conversations when Guantanamo Bay is still open. If we're going to be anti-colonialism, why are we talking in a school called Columbia? And I'm not saying that these are not hard conversations to have and harsh realities of how we got to the world that we live in today, but to say that we are going to, the only way to solve the Middle East is to deconstruct Israel based upon all of these principles when no other country merits that introspection is tremendously concerning to me. So I just want to go through a couple of incidents that actually happened, and I'll wrap up with those. So one of them was the Chicago Creating Change Conference. This was 2 years ago, and there was going to be a seminar put on by a wider bridge where they hosted leaders from the open house in Jerusalem to talk about the death of Shira Banki, a 16-year-old who was stabbed by a Jewish extremist while just attending the Pride Parade in Jerusalem, watching her friends in solidarity, a 16-year-old girl murdered. And they wanted to talk about not only that, but how they reach out to Palestinians, how they bring people together in this space. And instead, 300 people made the accordion walls of this conference room shake and shut the entire conversation down, chanting, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," which, as people know, is not really something that is a conversation point towards a two-state solution. So, to me, again, to be escorted out of the room and then see police called and have those same protesters say, well, you have the audacity to call the police on a queer group? Well, yeah, because you made a 300-person riot in a hotel and you put people at risk. And then some of them actually did break into the reception hall itself, took to the stage and started chanting Black Lives Matter. And again, intersectionality is a lovely concept, but if you knew that Israel had 150,000 Ethiopians who've emigrated and is also working as hard as it can to accommodate asylum seekers, yes, it's challenging now, and there's no easy answers to that problem either of how you help people move forward with their lives when they have nothing to return to, and this being the asylum seekers, and then the Ethiopians who have emigrated into the country and are Jewish. Well, Israel has a pretty good idea of what Black lives are and that they matter. So again, it's misrepresentation and it's putting the wrong buzzwords onto the concepts that are just so much broader. And then one thing that happened here in New York was the Israel Parade. So this was last year's Israel Parade that a number of Jewish Voice for Peace activists actually exploited the fact that a group called Jewish Queer Youth which is an organization here in New York that does a lot of work with queer and trans youth coming out of Orthodox Jewish families, gives them a chance to be themselves, to work with their families, with their yeshivas and seminaries, to be more inclusive, has done amazing work, and they exploited our openness and came in, put on our t-shirts, and marched the entire parade with us, only at the end to take off our shirts, pull out their signs that popped up, wear their t-shirts, turn off our music, try to wreck our sound system that we had on a pedicab, and link arms and refuse to move as the cops told them to the point where when we actually tried to proceed with the parade, they assaulted us by refusing to get out of our way. And the thing to me is that when you look at these groups and how they actually act, when you're calling yourself a queer group, the first rule is don't violate the space of another queer group. Don't violate the safe space. Don't traumatize people who are being brave enough, being seen in public, perhaps, affiliated with an LGBT organization of any kind. Recognize that even getting into the Israel parade as a queer group was difficult, much like St. Patrick's Day parades can be very homophobic to this day. And it's only about 3 or 4 years that the Israel parade has been allowing this group to march at all. So these are the kinds of things that I see happening. And yes, it's tremendously difficult, but what I remind people is that we have to stay present. We have to resist the urge to let these things divide us when so much else does. You know, today we think, well, Republicans can do nothing right, and Democrats can do nothing wrong, and if you don't believe in something Republican, then you must not believe in anything. But there were these few bipartisan issues, and Israel was one of them. And now because of that divisiveness, there's this space in the liberal community for this voice that says, oh, well, if the right likes Israel, then we must not. And we have to be out there and we have to be telling our leaders, especially in liberal places like New York, that they need to keep taking a stand, that they need to keep telling their constituents why they support Israel as well, especially in queer spaces, because that is one of the few places where they do align with the right. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, even though we want it to be today. So that's basically all the things that I wanted to go through. And just, I guess, one more thing I'll mention, because it just happened yesterday and today, or I guess Saturday, Sunday, and today. So again, just to point out the double standard. So again, I'm in awe of the students, of the voices across this country who've been marching for their lives. And of course, I think everyone in this room stands in solidarity with the idea that we should create safe spaces, not only to be ourselves in religion and in identity, but to learn and to grow, and to be able to grow up. And one thing that was noted on activist Emma Gonzalez, one of the Parkland students, is that she was wearing a jacket with a Cuban flag. And I think everyone who is reasonable in their sensibilities knows that she's highlighting her Cuban descent and isn't necessarily endorsing the regime of any specific leader in Cuba. But had that been an Israel flag, I don't think that sentiment would have been the same. And I think that's where the double standard comes into play. And I think that's where we need to be very, very vigilant.
I was wondering maybe if you can also share with us a little bit, maybe Assaf, because you worked in that, but if, of course, since you led Birthrights, I'm sure you have a lot of information as well. What was the transfer? Where we are today when it comes to Israel and LGBTQ? And do you feel that Jewish LGBTQ people here are aware enough of how it is in Israel, and are they trying to get involved? And how, that's my question.
I'm sorry, but I feel like it's going to be a long answer. I want to, first of all, it's a great question, because and it kind of relates to what Hannah said. I want to echo a little bit of what Hannah said about pinkwashing. And first of all, I completely agree. All of the rights and the achievement of the LGBTQ community in Israel weren't handed to us as a gift on a silver platter. We fought for them. We achieved them. We got them. We changed our communities for them. So that's number one. When you talk about pinkwashing, you belittle our struggle. Second thing is that pinkwashing is being used to put us against each other. It's minority politics. It basically means that for me, as a gay man, I'm in competition with the Palestinians over our rights, because whenever I get more rights, then it's being used to cover up what's being done to them. And it's not me against Palestinians. We're, you know, we all have our struggles and we fight for them. We are a discriminated community in our country. Now, as Dalia said, I don't feel that I need to sell something about Israel that is not true. We are a country, just like any other country. We have our problems, and we have our issue within the LGBTQ community. The LGBTQ community in Israel, it's the only minority in Israel that's being discriminated by law. There's no law that says that Arabs can do one thing and Jews can't do something. There's no law that says that men can do something and women cannot do something. But there is a law that says that straight people can do something and gays can't do something. That's the fact in Israel. But it's the fact all across the world. Like here, the transgender community is struggling for their places in the army, where in Israel, the transgender community is being accepted in the army, and actually being a transgender in the army, it's, I don't want to say easier, but better regarding your rights as a civilian. So each country has its own issues, and we're battling within our countries. And I don't feel that I need to present Israel as the pillar of LGBTQ rights across the world. It's not true. And when we come to this discussion, the difference between us and them is that they need to tell lies. They need to misrepresent the truth in order to get support. We tell the truth. We tell it like it is. We are confident within our, and I can say it, you know, the Israeli public has shown a lot of liberal towards the LGBTQ community. But regarding our legal status, we still have struggles in that, and that's okay. So I'm hoping that I answered your question, but if you want to lecture about the LGBTQ rights in Israel, you can do another event.
So I think, you know, where are we now? And I think it's a precarious, but it's a very hopeful place. And one of the important things to remember about being in support of the state of Israel is that peace is not a zero-sum game, and that anyone who wants it to make out where Israel only wins when Palestine loses and Palestine only wins when Israel is deconstructed is not seeing the either entirety of the picture of the Middle East and is really not seeing the facts on the ground. And I tell people, number one, go to Israel, especially as a queer person, even if only to hone your criticisms. Go to the West Bank too. I'm the nice Jewish girl who spent Christmas Eve in Bethlehem at midnight mass in St. Catherine's Monastery, talking to Palestinian Christians and just having a great time helping others express their own faith the way I hope that their neighbors in Israel can as well. And the majority of the Palestinian people are looking just to thrive. I was talking to a group of engineers in Ramallah, entrepreneurs in Ramallah, and they were talking about being young adults and trying to get external capital coming into their country. And they're like, you know, Google and Facebook set up in Israel. You want them to come here too. And, you know, we don't know why they don't. And, you know, I said, well, you know, tell me about being LGBT here. And they said, you know, it's difficult. We all have friends who are queer, and a lot of them leave to pursue their lives elsewhere. Not necessarily just in Israel, the refuge, but elsewhere in the world. And the idea being that there becomes this chicken and egg where companies don't want to establish themselves, especially when they have corporate responsibility and personas today, in places where they can't guarantee the safety or the expression of their employees. If you have enough trouble with North Carolina or Texas, how are you going to build a plant or a company in Ramallah. And these are companies that we would love to see there. So I think if we work on those things, I think furthermore, you can bring queer identity. If you can make that a larger place of where people come together, you can bring that investment in. I think you can use our experience to help bring people together, because you look in Israel and the queer people are all dating each other. They're sneaking into other places. They're going to Jordan where there are queer parties too, and they're having a great time as well. It's not just Israel anymore, thankfully, where queer movements are sprouting up. And it's not like you can say, oh, well, Israel is, you know, the only place. No, it's not anymore. Is it still one of the best places? Definitely. But if there's more great places, great, more tourist destinations. Someone's going to travel down to Tel Aviv and then go to Aqaba, and they're going to spend more money. So this can be a place where everybody wins. And that is what I think is really important. And when you get these conversations about BDS and then you walk into the old city, into the Arab quarters, and you see the t-shirt racks, and I've got pictures of them. They've got all the Israel shirts, all the funny ones, like all the sports teams with their names in Hebrew. And then they've got all the Free Palestine ones and all the, you know, other side. And they sell them like Yankees and Mets t-shirts. You know, you pick your sports team. And if BDS is a thing, why is it not starting in the old city of Jerusalem? And that always baffled me. And I think that's what's really important about queer identity, is that we are supposed to be fluid and non-binary. If there's so many genders, why are there only 2 stances on the Middle East? So the question was, how can Israel help liberate the identities of the Palestinian LGBT community? And it's a really tough question. It's real people's lives, and I don't want to downplay it, but it's kind of like asking, how can the Yankees improve the Mets' bullpen? And it's a really difficult question because there aren't a lot of easy answers, and a lot of this is going to happen from the larger bloc of Arab nations. And I think what we saw beginning with the Arab Spring, that I believe started, you know, on the northern coast of Africa and moved its way east all the way, you know, into Iraq and Iran, and people were standing up to their governments and saying, you know, we're tired of being persecuted, we're tired of failed governments, we want reforms, we want to see all of these changes, we want the end of the monarchy in Saudi Arabia, we want to be able to drive if we're female. And if you can't even have the conversation about driving as a female, it's very hard to talk about queer people. And I think that's where a lot of this conversation is going to come into play. And I think that there's so many other countries that have an influence on the Palestinian people. Unfortunately, largely to this point, it hasn't been good. Let's not forget that there was not a Palestinian nation before 1967, when those territories were respectively sovereign to Egypt and to Jordan, respectively. It was called Transjordan, and it crossed the Jordan River. Now it's Cisjordan. And I think it's really important to remember that Jordan, Egypt, Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Syria have an influence on this place, and change in the Arab world is going to be systemic, it is going to be beautiful, it is going to be glorious, and it's going to come when those citizens take their own identities into their hands and determine for themselves how they want to see a future moving forward. And I don't know if Israel is the only place that can do that.
As a gay Israeli, I can tell you that I would love for the Israeli government to be as I said, the pillar of LGBTQ rights in the world, and to promote LGBTQ rights in everywhere in the world, not only in the Palestinians. But that's not Israel's role, with all due respect. Like, I don't expect any other government to operate against the Israeli government to work on my discrimination. We're doing that in our community. We're doing that in our country. We take responsibility. That's the entire concept of what we're talking about today. We're taking responsibility on our fate. And I would actually expect, and I know that there are groups who are working on that within the LGBTQ Palestinian community, I would expect the Palestinian people to take responsibility on their fate and to work on their communities. Now, it's not only LGBTQ people, it's also women. It's a lot of things that within those societies that has difficulties. And it's not, I care about that, I identify, I want them to stop suffering, but it's for them to make it happen. And with all the respect, I don't think that Israel has to have the role of playing that within the society. I always finish whenever on a panel with something. I sat in your position last year, and I was shocked by the amount of nonsense that I heard from panelists and from lecturers and from presentation in all of those events. And I was even more shocked by the amount of nonsense that I heard that could be easily disputed by Google. So I urge you not to trust us, not to listen to everything we said. Fact check us, Google us, get your own independent opinion about all of these issues, and be your own person with your own opinion, and don't listen to anyone else. Google us. Thank you.
Can I add a? So Israel is, surrounded by hostile neighbors and is often made out to be the aggressor. It's very misunderstood by a lot of the community. People paint all these slurs against it, call it predatory, call it all kinds of terrible things. And there's this other group of people that are also called predatory, that are, accused of entering hostile environments, but really are just there to maybe use the bathroom. And they're transgender people. And if I can parlay this idea that, hey, I as a trans person am often misunderstood, and I'm a little bit cuter and a lot less threatening in person than whatever hypothetical you have drummed up in your mind, then maybe we can do the same with Israel. And that's why I can talk about these two different topics and put myself in the room with somebody like Mike Pence or another person who believes like that, he does, and say, you know what, Israel is bringing us together, not tearing us apart.